Sarah Martinez never imagined that her third deployment to Iraq would test every ounce of strength she possessed. The 8-year-old Army medic from Texas had already served 2 tours, but nothing could have prepared her for what awaited in the dusty streets of Fallujah. The morning of March 15th started like any other. Sarah checked her medical supplies one final time, ensuring every bandage and medication was properly secured in her pack. Her unit, the 3rd Infantry Division's medical support team, was preparing for a routine patrol through the city's eastern district. Intelligence reports suggested minimal insurgent activity in the area, making it what commanders called a milk run. As the convoy of 4 Humvees rolled through the gates of Forward Operating Base Courage, Sarah felt the familiar weight of responsibility settle on her shoulders. She wasn't just a medic. She was the lifeline for 32 soldiers who depended on her skills when everything went wrong. Her hands, steady and sure, had already saved dozens of lives during her previous deployments. The streets of Fallujah told stories of a city trying to rebuild itself. Children played soccer with makeshift balls, while their mothers hung laundry from balconies. Shop owners swept debris from their doorsteps, preparing for another day of business. Sarah watched through the bulletproof glass of her vehicle, noting how different this district seemed from the war-torn areas she'd seen before. Staff Sergeant Mike Thompson, her squad leader, sat across from her reviewing the day's mission objectives. They would establish a medical checkpoint near the local hospital, provide aid to civilians, and gather intelligence about insurgent movements in the area. It was humanitarian work that Sarah loved most about her job, helping people regardless of which side of the conflict they represented. The convoy moved slowly through narrow streets lined with concrete barriers and razor wire. Local Iraqi police waved from their checkpoints, a sign that this area remained relatively stable. Sarah felt cautiously optimistic as she prepared her medical station near the hospital entrance. Within an hour, a steady stream of civilians approached their position. An elderly man brought his grandson who had been suffering from a persistent fever. Sarah worked efficiently, her Arabic language skills helping her communicate with patients and build trust within the community. The warmth of the Iraqi people reminded Sarah why she'd chosen to extend her service. Despite the dangers and hardships, moments like these made every sacrifice worthwhile. She documented each patient's condition carefully, ensuring they could receive follow-up care from local medical facilities. As the afternoon sun reached its peak, Sarah noticed increased radio chatter among the security team. Intelligence reports were coming in about possible insurgent movement in nearby neighborhoods, but nothing that immediately threatened their position. The Iraqi police maintained their posts, and local traffic continued flowing normally through the area. Around 2 p.m., Sarah was treating a young boy with a badly infected cut on his leg when she heard the distinctive whistle of incoming mortars. Years of training kicked in immediately. She grabbed the child and dove behind the concrete barriers just as the first explosion rocked their position. The attack came from multiple directions simultaneously. Mortar rounds crashed into the street, while automatic weapons fire erupted from rooftops and windows. Sarah's training took over as she assessed the tactical situation while treating the wounded Iraqi boy who had been with her when the attack began. Staff Sergeant Thompson's voice crackled through her radio, coordinating defensive positions and calling for immediate air support. The convoy's gunners returned fire while the drivers maneuvered their vehicles to provide better cover for the medical team. Sarah's position behind the concrete barrier provided limited protection, but she refused to abandon the wounded civilians who had sought their help. An Iraqi woman had been caught in the open when the shooting started, and she was bleeding heavily from shrapnel wounds to her abdomen. Moving under fire, Sarah reached the woman and began applying pressure to her wounds. The metallic taste of fear filled her mouth, but her hands remained steady as she worked to save the stranger's life. Around her, the battle intensified as more insurgents joined the attack. The sound of approaching helicopters gave Sarah hope that air support would soon suppress the enemy fire. She continued treating the wounded woman while coordinating with her team to establish a secure casualty collection point behind their vehicles. But the insurgents had planned their ambush carefully. As the helicopters approached, shoulder-fired missiles streaked through the sky. One Apache gunship took a direct hit and crashed in a nearby courtyard, adding urgency to an already desperate situation. Sarah realized that their routine mission had become a fight for survival. The enemy had superior numbers and positions, and ammunition was running low among her unit. She made the difficult decision to move the wounded civilians to a more secure location inside the hospital building. Carrying the Iraqi woman under intense fire, Sarah felt the first bullet graze her shoulder. The impact spun her around, but she maintained her grip on her patient and continued moving toward safety. Inside the hospital, she found several rooms that could serve as an improvised aid station. As she worked to stabilize the wounded woman, Sarah heard explosions getting closer to their position. The insurgents were advancing, using rocket-propelled grenades to destroy the convoy's vehicles, one by one. Her radio crackled with urgent requests for medical assistance as more soldiers were wounded in the fighting. The hospital staff had evacuated when the shooting started, leaving Sarah alone with several wounded civilians and limited medical supplies. She set up triage areas in different rooms, preparing for the casualties she knew would come as the battle escalated. Through the hospital windows, Sarah could see muzzle flashes from buildings across the street. The insurgents had turned the neighborhood into a maze of kill zones, making movement extremely dangerous for her unit. She realized that extraction would be difficult, if not impossible, until air support could neutralize the enemy positions. Her radio brought devastating news. Staff Sergeant Thompson had been seriously wounded, and 2 other soldiers were missing. Sarah faced an impossible choice between staying with the wounded civilians in the hospital and attempting to reach her fellow soldiers who needed immediate medical attention. The weight of that decision would haunt her for the rest of her life. As explosions continued to rock the building around her, Sarah Martinez prepared for the longest fight of her military career, knowing that survival would require every skill she possessed and some luck she couldn't count on. Sarah made her choice. She couldn't abandon the wounded civilians in the hospital, but she also couldn't leave her fellow soldiers to die in the street. Using her medical training and combat experience, she developed a plan that might save everyone if she moved quickly and carefully. She established a secure aid station in the hospital's basement, moving the wounded Iraqi woman and 3 other civilians to the safest location she could find. Using IV lines and medical supplies from her pack, she stabilized their conditions and left them with clear instructions in Arabic about basic wound care. The journey back to her unit's position required crossing 200 yards of open ground under intense enemy fire. Sarah studied the street through a broken window, identifying covered positions and planning her route carefully. She knew she would only get one chance to reach her wounded teammates. Taking a deep breath, Sarah burst through the hospital's side entrance and sprinted toward the first piece of cover. Bullets sparked off the concrete around her as insurgent fighters tried to track her movement. She dove behind a burned-out car and immediately assessed her next move. The radio chatter in her earpiece painted a grim picture. 2 vehicles were destroyed, ammunition was critically low, and at least 6 soldiers needed immediate medical attention. Air support was still 20 minutes away, an eternity in combat time. Sarah spotted Staff Sergeant Thompson behind an overturned Humvee. He was conscious but bleeding heavily from his leg and arm. She calculated the distance at about 50 yards, with minimal cover between her position and his. The enemy fire was coming from 3 different buildings, making direct movement suicide. Instead, Sarah used smoke grenades to create a visual barrier while she low-crawled through debris and rubble. The acrid smoke burned her lungs, but it provided the concealment she needed to reach Thompson's position without being seen by the insurgent snipers. Thompson was in worse condition than she'd initially thought. Shrapnel had severed an artery in his thigh, and he was losing blood rapidly. Sarah applied a tourniquet while enemy bullets continued to impact the vehicle they sheltered behind. Her hands worked automatically, following procedures drilled into her through countless training exercises. While treating Thompson, Sarah learned the full scope of their situation. Privates Jackson and Rodriguez were pinned down in a building across the street, both wounded and running low on ammunition. Specialist Kim was unconscious near the destroyed lead vehicle, possibly suffering from a traumatic brain injury from an explosion. Sarah realized she needed to prioritize her patients based on who she could save and who had the best chance of survival. It was the hardest part of combat medicine, making life and death decisions in seconds while under fire. She stabilized Thompson's bleeding and moved toward Kim's position. The unconscious soldier was breathing but unresponsive, with obvious signs of concussion and possible internal injuries. Sarah had to make another crucial decision: attempt to move Kim to better cover or treat him in place, under enemy fire. The insurgents had identified her location and were concentrating their fire on the destroyed Humvee. Bullets punched through the vehicle's armor, and Sarah knew they had to move or die. She grabbed Kim under the arms and began dragging him toward a concrete drainage ditch that offered better protection. Halfway to the ditch, Sarah felt the first bullet hit her back. The impact knocked her down, but her body armor absorbed most of the energy. She continued pulling Kim towards safety, ignoring the burning sensation spreading across her shoulders. The second bullet hit her left arm, spinning her around and causing her to lose her grip on Kim. Blood poured down her sleeve, but she forced herself to complete the movement to cover. Once in the ditch, she applied pressure to her arm wound and continued treating Kim's head injury. Her radio crackled with updates from the other wounded soldiers. Jackson and Rodriguez were trapped in a building surrounded by insurgents. They had limited ammunition and no way to reach the main unit. Sarah realized she was the only one who could attempt a rescue. Against every tactical principle she'd been taught, Sarah decided to cross the street and reach the trapped soldiers. She knew the odds were against her, but she couldn't live with herself if she didn't try to save them. Using the last of her smoke grenades, Sarah created another visual barrier and sprinted across the open street. Enemy fire erupted from multiple positions, and she felt bullets tugging at her uniform as she ran. She reached the building where Jackson and Rodriguez were trapped, only to find the entrance blocked by rubble from an explosion. Sarah found a hole in the building's wall created by an RPG blast. She squeezed through the opening and called out to identify herself to the trapped soldiers. Their voices came from the second floor, where they had taken defensive positions after being cut off from the main unit. Climbing the damaged staircase while carrying medical supplies and wounded by gunfire herself, Sarah reached her teammates. Jackson had a bullet wound in his shoulder, while Rodriguez was suffering from severe burns on his arms and face from an incendiary grenade. She immediately began treating Rodriguez's burns with the limited supplies she had remaining. The young soldier was in tremendous pain, but trying not to cry out, knowing that noise might reveal their position to the insurgents searching the building below. Sarah worked quickly to stabilize both soldiers while planning their escape route. The building was surrounded, but she had noticed a window on the backside that opened onto a narrow alley. If they could reach it without being detected, they might be able to work their way back to the main unit. As she bandaged Rodriguez's burns, Sarah heard footsteps and voices in Arabic on the floor below. The insurgents were systematically searching the building, moving room by room toward their position. She grabbed her rifle and prepared to defend her patients. The sound of approaching helicopters gave Sarah hope that air support had finally arrived. Through the window, she could see Apache gunships engaging the insurgent positions with rockets and cannon fire. The enemy's attention turned skyward, giving her team a brief opportunity to move. Sarah helped Jackson and Rodriguez toward the back window, while the insurgents were distracted by the helicopter attack. The plan was working until Rodriguez's equipment got caught on debris, creating noise that alerted the fighters below. Shouts in Arabic echoed through the building as insurgents rushed up the stairs. Sarah positioned herself at the stairwell entrance, knowing she had to buy time for Jackson to help Rodriguez through the window. Her rifle felt heavy in her wounded arms, but she steadied it against the door frame and prepared to fight. The first insurgent appeared at the top of the stairs, and Sarah fired immediately. Her shot was accurate, but there were more fighters behind him. She fired rapidly, using every round in her magazine while Jackson struggled to get the wounded Rodriguez out the window. Sarah's position became untenable as more insurgents reached the second floor. She threw her last grenade down the hallway and dove toward the window. Jackson had successfully lowered Rodriguez into the alley and was waiting to help her escape. But as Sarah reached the window, multiple automatic weapons opened fire from the hallway behind her. She felt bullets striking her back, legs, and arms in rapid succession. The impacts threw her forward through the window, and she fell hard into the alley below. Jackson immediately began applying pressure to her wounds, but Sarah had been hit at least 8 times. She was conscious but losing blood rapidly from multiple serious injuries. Rodriguez, despite his own wounds, used his radio to call for immediate medical evacuation. Sarah's vision began to fade as shock set in from massive blood loss. She had saved her teammates, but the cost had been devastating. As Jackson worked frantically to keep her alive, she could hear the distinctive sound of SEAL team helicopters approaching their position. The rescue she had fought so hard to achieve was finally arriving, but Sarah Martinez was running out of time. Her pulse grew weaker as she drifted in and out of consciousness, wondering if she would survive to see the dawn of another day. Jackson's voice became distant and muffled as Sarah slipped deeper into shock. She had been shot 14 times, with bullets hitting her chest, back, arms, and legs. Blood pooled beneath her in the narrow alley, while Rodriguez maintained radio contact with the incoming rescue team. The SEAL helicopters couldn't land immediately due to continued enemy fire from surrounding buildings. Air support was working to suppress the insurgent positions, but the urban environment made close air support extremely dangerous with friendly forces in the area. Sarah drifted in and out of consciousness, her body fighting to survive massive trauma and blood loss. In her lucid moments, she could hear Jackson talking to her, urging her to stay awake and keep fighting. His voice became her anchor to the world as everything else faded away. Time became meaningless for Sarah. Minutes felt like hours as she lay in the alley, her life slowly draining away. Jackson had applied tourniquets to her limbs and pressure bandages to her torso wounds, but he was a rifleman, not a medic. He was doing his best with limited knowledge and fewer supplies. Rodriguez, despite his severe burns, crawled closer to help Jackson treat Sarah's wounds. The young soldier tore strips from his uniform to create additional pressure bandages, ignoring his own pain to help save the woman who had risked everything to rescue them. The sound of helicopters grew louder, then faded as the aircraft circled the area looking for a safe landing zone. Sarah's radio crackled with updates from the SEAL team commander. They had identified her position but needed additional air support to neutralize the enemy fighters before attempting extraction. Sarah's breathing became shallow and irregular. Jackson checked her pulse repeatedly, feeling it grow weaker each time. He began talking to her about home, describing the ranch in Montana where he grew up, trying to keep her mind focused on something other than the pain. The first day passed slowly. Air Force jets made several bombing runs on insurgent positions, gradually reducing the enemy's ability to contest the landing zones. But Sarah's condition continued to deteriorate, despite Jackson and Rodriguez's best efforts to keep her stable. During the night, Sarah's body temperature dropped dangerously low. Jackson and Rodriguez took turns sharing their body heat with her, covering her with their jackets and lying close to prevent hypothermia from finishing what the bullets had started. Rodriguez's burns were becoming infected, and Jackson was exhausted from staying awake to monitor Sarah's condition. The young soldiers were facing their own survival crisis while trying to keep their medic alive. The second day brought new challenges. Sarah's wounds showed signs of infection, and she had developed a fever, despite her overall hypothermia. Jackson used water from their emergency supplies to clean her wounds as best he could, but medical supplies were nearly exhausted. Sarah regained consciousness several times during the second day, though she remained very weak and confused. She mumbled instructions to Jackson about treating Rodriguez's burns and managing her own care, her medical training taking over even in her critical condition. Radio contact with the SEAL team provided updates on the rescue effort. The insurgents had reinforced their positions overnight, bringing in additional fighters and weapons. The area had become a major battleground, with Army and Marine units engaged in heavy fighting to clear safe corridors for medical evacuation. Late in the afternoon of the second day, Sarah stopped breathing. Jackson immediately began CPR, following the basic life support training all soldiers received. Rodriguez counted compressions while Jackson provided rescue breathing, both soldiers fighting desperately to save the woman who had saved them. After several terrifying minutes, Sarah began breathing again, though her pulse remained extremely weak. Jackson and Rodriguez realized she was dying, and there was nothing more they could do with their limited medical knowledge and supplies. As the sun set on the second day, The distinctive sound of helicopter rotors approached their position again. This time, the aircraft didn't circle or retreat. Heavy weapons fire erupted from multiple directions as Apache gunships engaged remaining insurgent positions with devastating effect. Rodriguez spotted movement at the end of the alley. Figures in camouflage appeared, moving with the precise coordination of Special Operations Forces. The SEAL team had finally fought through to their position. Navy SEAL medics immediately took over Sarah's care, establishing IV lines and administering medications that Jackson and Rodriguez didn't have access to. The team leader coordinated with air support to establish a secure landing zone for medical evacuation. The SEAL medic working on Sarah shook his head grimly as he assessed her condition. She had survived 2 days with massive trauma and blood loss, infections, and hypothermia. Her pulse was barely detectable, and her breathing was extremely shallow. Within minutes, a medical evacuation helicopter landed in a nearby courtyard that had been cleared of debris and enemy fighters. The SEAL team moved quickly to transfer Sarah to the aircraft, while maintaining security around the landing zone. As they loaded Sarah onto the helicopter, she briefly regained consciousness. Her eyes focused on the SEAL medic, and she whispered something that he couldn't hear over the rotor noise. He leaned closer as she repeated her words. "Take care of my patients." Even facing death, Sarah's first concern was for the wounded civilians she had left in the hospital basement 2 days earlier. The SEAL medic assured her that other units had already secured the hospital and evacuated the injured Iraqis she had treated. The helicopter lifted off with Sarah aboard, beginning a race against time to reach the trauma center at the main military hospital. The flight took 12 minutes, during which the helicopter medical team fought to keep her alive with advanced life support equipment. Surgeons were waiting when the helicopter landed. Sarah was rushed directly into the operating room, where a team of specialists began the complex process of repairing 14 bullet wounds and treating complications from 2 days of delayed medical care. The surgical team worked for 18 hours straight, removing bullet fragments, repairing damaged organs, and addressing infections that had developed during her time in the alley. Multiple blood transfusions were required to replace what she had lost over the previous 2 days. Jackson and Rodriguez were treated at the same hospital for their injuries. They maintained a vigil outside the surgical suite, refusing to leave until they knew whether Sarah would survive. Other members of their unit joined them as word spread about the medic who had risked everything to save her teammates. After 3 days in surgery and intensive care, Sarah finally opened her eyes. She was connected to machines that monitored every aspect of her condition, and her body was still fighting infections and complications from her injuries. The doctors told her that her survival was medically inexplicable. She had lost over half her blood volume, suffered massive tissue damage, and endured conditions that should have been fatal within hours. Her recovery would take months and require multiple additional surgeries. Sarah's first visitors were Jackson and Rodriguez, both recovering from their own injuries. They sat beside her bed and shared stories about what had happened after she lost consciousness, including details about the SEAL rescue operation and the fight to clear the area. Sarah learned that her actions had saved not only Jackson and Rodriguez, but also the wounded civilians in the hospital and several other soldiers who were successfully evacuated once the area was secured. Her decision to stay and fight had prevented what could have been a much larger tragedy. The Army awarded Sarah the Silver Star for her extraordinary heroism under fire. The citation described her actions as conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity in action against an enemy of the United States, and noted that her courage had directly saved multiple lives. Recovery was a long and painful process. Sarah endured months of physical therapy to regain mobility and strength in her arms and legs. Some of her wounds required additional surgeries to remove scar tissue and restore function to damaged muscles. Despite the physical challenges, Sarah's spirit remained strong. She corresponded regularly with the Iraqi families she had helped, learning that all of the civilians she treated had survived their injuries. The connection she had made during those brief hours before the attack had created lasting bonds across cultural and language barriers. Jackson and Rodriguez visited Sarah frequently during her recovery, bringing updates from their unit and sharing news about other soldiers they had served with. The three had formed an unbreakable bond through their shared experience in the alley. Sarah eventually returned to duty, though in a different capacity. Her injuries prevented her from serving as a field medic, but she became an instructor at the military's medical training center, passing her knowledge and experience to the next generation of combat medics. Years later, Sarah still carried scars from her 14 bullet wounds, but she had gained something more valuable than physical healing. She had learned that the human spirit could survive almost anything when fueled by dedication to others and an unwavering commitment to duty. The story of those 2 days in Fallujah became legendary within military medical circles. Sarah Martinez had proven that sometimes the greatest victories come not from winning battles, but from refusing to surrender when everything seems lost. Her survival stood as testimony to the power of teamwork, the importance of never giving up, and the extraordinary things that ordinary people can accomplish when they place others before themselves. The young medic from Texas had become a symbol of courage and dedication that would inspire others for generations to come.